This first slide talks about it being a potential forest product for Eastern Kentucky, but I want to say that it's really not limited to Eastern Kentucky. Anywhere that has acer trees, that would be box elder, sugar maple, red maple, any of those can be used. So we're just gonna go through and talk about what maple syrup is and how we got interested in it. A number of years ago, I was on a Farm Bureau trip in Iowa, and my family and I sat down with a couple of guys that were from Maine, and I asked them what they did in the ag field, and they were into maple syrup. And so we had an interesting talk. And a few years later, I was on a backpacking trip in Virginia and came across a place near Mount Rogers where the local fire department had leased land off of the Forest Service, and they tapped the maple trees for maple syrup, and they use that as a fundraiser for their city's fire department for the year, and it's their main fundraiser. So that kind of stoked the interest in maple for me, and it led to a lot of research and ultimately the promotion of it in the county and the area. But it's a naturally occurring sweetener, if you didn't know. Sometimes people think that, that this is like corn syrup, but it's actually just the sap from the maple trees that has been boiled to the point that it concentrates it down. And when it reaches 66.6% Brix, which is how you measure sugar, it officially becomes syrup. And so that's a USDA definition. Now and when I say we, I'm referring to more modern Americans. We didn't come up with this. It was used by the early Americans, the Native Americans, if you will, for as long as there was a historical record. And they didn't really do it quite the way that we do. They would hollow out a log like a trough, and they would heat up rocks and put the rocks into the sap, and it would just continue to create steam. And as long as it takes us to cook it down, I can't imagine how long it would take to cook it down with heated rocks, but that's how they did it. The suspicion is that they didn't cook it all the way to syrup, that they just got it to the point of being really sweet. And if you think about it, if you don't have ready access to sweeteners, anything would be better than what their normal diet would be. So it's been going on for a long time in North America. There are a lot of health benefits from it. There's been some research in Canada that has found that it is very high in antioxidants. And I actually read an article not too long ago that said that it was actually on par with some of our better fruits, so like blueberries and such. Maybe unlike corn syrup, which gets a bad rap, maple syrup is considered to be health food. So you can eat this. It's like the dark chocolate of syrups, and you can eat it and feel good about yourself. No guilt necessary. And so other ways that it could be concentrated, and the early Americans used, were to freeze it. And so the sugars tend not to freeze, it's just the water. And so it tends to freeze from the top down. And so if you put it in a bucket or something and it starts to freeze at the top, you can continue to remove the ice layer from the top, and that will also concentrate the sap. It's just not as efficient. And if you're not careful, you do end up throwing away some of the sugar that way. So that's why we don't use that approach. It takes on average about 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup. And that's kind of on the optimistic side. It tends to be more like around 43, 48 to 1. And that's if your original sap was at 3%, which it almost never is unless you have it in a managed place. So if if you've got a maple tree that is in a large open space, getting lots of sunlight and has a very big crown with lots of leaves, then those trees are going to be more efficient at producing the sap with high sugar concentration. Obviously, fertile soils. So if you live in central Kentucky or places that have richer native ground, those trees are going to tend to produce higher concentrations of sugar. Most of our trees in Kentucky, if they have been in the woods or in unmanaged places, it's going to be more like 60, upwards of 80 to 1. So the brick concentration is more like about 1 to 1.5. And this is kind of exponential. So if you start off with your sap at around 1%, it can take an hour to go from basically it's an hour to double it. So if you start at a 1, it would take about an hour to go to 2. But if you start off at a 3, then in an hour you're at 6. So where you start makes that has a big impact on how quickly you can be to syrup. It can vary from tree to tree and from year to year and even through the season. And that is a function of the growing conditions of the individual tree and of the weather that you've had. So if you've had an overcast, wet year, they tend to not have as concentrated a sap for the following year. So for folks that were in West Kentucky this year, your trees may have really high sugar concentrations next year just because they had a lot of sunlight. And that's a good thing for the sap. So as far as the trees, it can be made from any of the Acer species. And box elder, if you're familiar with this tree, it's a very stinky tree. If you break the leaves off or smell the bark, I think it's kind of a nasty, pungent smell. I don't care for it, but it makes an incredible syrup. And I really thought that it would impart the flavor of that regular box elder to the sap and into the syrup, but it does not. And it honestly, I've had syrup from all of the maple species in North America, and box elder was my favorite. So don't cull the weed tree. It can be used as well. So as far as the use of it, sometimes people think that one of the benefits to having woods is that you get to log them. But we have a lot of people that do not want to log their timber, or maybe you live in a place that you just have a few trees and timber isn't a consideration. You only have to have 2 or 3 trees to be able to make a batch of maple syrup. And if you want to do it as a hobby or a novelty type thing, 2 or 3 trees is perfect for that. And it would produce enough syrup to probably do your family for the year. If you've got a few more trees, let's say you've got 100 or so, it starts to be enough that you could produce enough syrup to share or to sell. And anything really above 250, and it started to be kind of a hobby producer, and anything above 500 taps, and you're talking about commercial level. So one of the things that we like about this is that it's great for extra farm income. You can produce it at a time of the year that there's not other things going on. So this is usually January, February, and most farmers haven't geared up at that point. They're just planning. It's very tourism compatible. People have an affinity for maple syrup, and they view it in a way that is really in a special category. They view it as a very wholesome thing, and you can attract a lot of business. We've got folks that sell at the farmers market, and they leverage their maple syrup production as an enticement to get more customers to their booth at the farmers market. So, if you have an Airbnb, or if you have maybe some sort of an agritourism approach, maple is incredibly good. It's also good because if you have a festival that springs from it, it happens at a time of the year that you wouldn't have a lot of competition. And when you go up north, Maine in particular has a Maine maple weekend, and folks come out to buy their entire year's supply of maple syrup at those festivals. And so it is a huge economic boost at a time of the year when people need that. So we have primarily red maples in Kentucky, but that's followed very closely by sugar maple, and that can vary depending on the part of the state that you're in. Either one of those can be used to make maple syrup. The red tends to be a little higher in niter, which is the insoluble sugar that is produced sometimes when you evaporate the sap down. It's just kind of a gritty, sandy type material, and you remove that by filtering it off. Sugar maples are less prone to that problem, and we're not exactly sure why that is, but know that they tend to have less niter than the reds do. But don't segregate up north. If they come to a red maple tree, they do not run separate lines or treat that sap any differently. They just collect it all together and make it all as one big batch. Individual trees, as I've talked about earlier, they can vary pretty widely in their sugar content, and that is going to be based on genetics even. Cornell University did some research and found that they had some trees that they had identified that were naturally 6 to 8% in their sugar concentration. And so if you go back to that original comment about it being exponential, if you can start off at 6 to 8%, that's an incredible thing. So you might think about the genetics of the trees in your area. And if you want to test around, we found that we have some trees that just aren't worth tapping, and they look perfectly healthy. They've got good canopies. Just for whatever reason, they do not produce sap very well. And individual red trees, red maples, can have higher sugar concentrations than individual sugar maples. So it's not, you can't just say, well, it's a sugar maple, so it has to be higher in sugar. It doesn't work that way. The individual is more important than the last name. So if you think about your family's last name, mine's Baker. Just because my last name's Baker doesn't mean that all bakers are the same, or that we're all equally good at baking. And so it's the same thing for these trees. The name is less important than the individual. One thing is reds will tend to start to flow earlier than sugar maples. So you want to make sure that you catch those trees, that you've got them tapped and ready to go pretty early. They also tend to dry up faster. And so the sugar maples tend to allow you to extend the season a little further. You want to look for healthy trees with no defects. Make sure that the canopy of the tree hasn't been damaged during the winter. If you have broken tree limbs, oftentimes you'll have all the sap running down from that break in the tree limb. And so just avoid those. Make sure that the tree is at least 10 inches in diameter. And that's to make sure that you're not stressing the tree. You are kind of removing the lifeblood of the tree, and we're just taking a little bit. So it would be about like taking a blood sample from you. But if you overdo it, or if you take a sample, too much from a small tree, it can't really compensate for that. So we tell you to not tap anything that is smaller than 10 inches in diameter. So you want crowns that are broad, greater than 30 feet, and deep, and the leaves are the food producer. So if you go into a place that it's growing in with other trees, the canopies of those trees will tend to be very much like a column, and those are not as efficient as the ones that are very rounded. So if you've got a choice, pick the rounded ones. The trees that are great for timber are not necessarily the ones that you want for sap. And it's because, for timber, they want those upright trees with few branches. But for this, we want them to be bushy and have a lot of limbs. So Try to find trees that are readily accessible. If you're doing this on a hobby level, you're going to be collecting in buckets, typically gallon jugs or 5-gallon buckets. And so you want things that you're going to be able to easily get to. You want the trees to be able to just pull up, grab the bucket, empty it into a container, and go. We had some folks that attempted to do this on our steep mountainsides with a bucket system, and that is just a death wish. You can imagine in the wintertime when the ground's frozen, what it would be like trying to pack those pails down the hill. So look for places that are easy to get to. The ideal weather conditions are nights that are frosty, below freezing, 25 to 35 degrees, and that have mild days around 40 to 60. And what happens is this starts to create a vacuum in the tree from the pressure difference from when the tree is frozen and when it thaws. That's what kind of gins the pump and gets the sap to flow. And so if you have times where the nights do not get below freezing, the sap flow tends to fall off. Now, I have a little asterisk next to this, that if you want to try a vacuum system, that can make that whole temperature thing irrelevant. If you have it on a vacuum pump, they can flow regardless of whether it's freezing or not. The other thing I would say, there's a little caveat to this. We have had trees continue to flow for multiple weeks since the last freeze. So this is not a set in stone thing. We kind of joke that the trees make up their own mind when the sap's going to flow. And we know that it is somewhat impacted by the temperatures, but that is not an ironclad rule. They will sometimes flow when you don't expect them to. So you have to be ready. And that means if you're on a bucket system, that you are checking those buckets daily so that it's not overflowing and you're not losing your sap. We used to tell people that it was between Valentine's Day and St. Patrick's Day. And that's what all the early extension literature in Kentucky said. But we pretty soon found out that that was far too late. Most people now, we tell them as soon as Christmas or New Year's is over, go ahead and tap your trees. And what you're trying to do, you've got about a month window from when you drill the hole in the tree to when the tree closes that hole back off and shuts the sap flow down. So you don't want to retap because that stresses the tree. So you're trying to guesstimate when the middle of that flow will be. And a lot of times that involves looking at the long range forecast. And if you see that it's going to be 20s and 40s for the next 2 or 3 weeks, you definitely want to make sure that you're tapped in. If we happen to be in the middle of a freakishly warm early January, then I would tell you to hold off a little bit and wait for the weather to be a little more conducive. But it's a learning curve, and that's going to vary from year to year. Generally, here at the office, we've got a demonstration. We tap as soon as we come back from Christmas break, and usually we're shut down by the middle of February. So that should give you an ideal of when to aim for. So as far as getting equipment, now is a great time of the year to order equipment from now up through November. You avoid the chaos and the rush. So I would tell you, go ahead and buy your taps, your buckets, your tubing, anything that you're going to get. Any questions so far? If you're wanting to get into a little larger operation, you might consider going out and GPSing each individual tree and plot that on a map so that you can see how to most efficiently run your tubing. So that's the reason to consider being a little more technical. But otherwise, you can just go through when the trees have their leaves on them. It's always easier to identify the trees this time of the year. We marked our red maples with one color of paint and our sugar maples with another color of paint. And it just made it easier when you start running the tubing to be able to see where you need to go to. And I know that this is a horticulture group, and we have some experts in the room that probably could identify a maple tree blindfolded. I can tell you that I have spent a lot of time in the woods, and I consider myself to be an expert on tree identification. Any individual tree can fool you. And I have been fooled before. We've got one producer who I will not name that inadvertently tapped a white oak one time. And when I came up to look, I could see why it fooled him. It was a weird tree. But anyway, identify your trees first and get your stuff ready, your equipment wise, and determine how many trees that you have. And you might even consider testing them first to see what the sugar concentration is going to be. So as far as the number of taps per tree, you can see from this little rough guide that if it's 10 to 15 inches diameter at breast height, that they're recommending 1 tap. If it gets a little bigger, you can do 2 taps, but no more than 4, and that maxes out when you get at 25 inches. I will tell you that when we've gone up north on maple tours, they generally standardize their operations. We almost never saw anybody have more than 2 taps in a tree, and a lot of the folks only had 1. And it was just because it was a lot faster and simpler, to go through with. If you start running tubing, you'll understand why the 1 tap would be easier. The 2 taps kind of looks like a stethoscope hanging from the tree. But once you start getting into 3, it's just, you're not really getting that much additional sap flow. So it's probably not worth the trouble. When you over tap the trees, it does hurt the trees and it can impact production in subsequent years. So there's reasons not to do it. If you under tap, you're going to reduce your yield of sap. So I would say 1 or 2 taps. If you hear the term sugar bush, that's usually what they use to describe the area that's being tapped for maple syrup production. So, just like you might say, I'm going out to the field, they say I'm going to the sugar bush. And you need to manage that if you're going to do this for the long term. And it can mean, just like when you garden, when you thin out the weeds, a lot of folks will selectively manage their sugar bush by eliminating competing trees. Obviously, you wouldn't want to cut down high value trees like oaks and hickories, but if you've got junk trees, maybe hackberries or poplars or sycamores or something that doesn't have much value otherwise, then we do crop tree release, where we will ring those competitive trees. And you do this slowly, one side of the tree at a time, so that it doesn't shock the tree by having too much sunlight at once. But research into fertilizing the trees has been promising. So if you've got a few trees in your yard, it's not a bad thing to put a little triple 10 around them to try to get them to grow a little more. And you want them to have some breathing room so that canopy has room to expand. And usually that's going to be about 6 feet around. Some people have experimented with clover around their trees. One thing that you'll want to purchase is a hydrometer. And if you've ever made wine, you probably recognize this thing. It floats in the solution of the sap, and the concentration dictates how deep it will sink. And so that kind of determines, there's little degradations on the tube that tell you then what the concentration is. And so sometimes people refer to that as bricks, but it's just it's a degree of sugar. You can get these, by the way, in a digital form as well. And I like the digital one really well, but it's expensive. So if you're doing it just as a hobby producer, the little simple float one would be preferable. Those are pretty cheap. The digital ones are around $200 to $300. So Usually what people will do is they will test their sap at a certain temperature because it's temperature dependent. And when you're cooking, this is just like when you make candy, the boiling point of water on an individual day is dictated by the barometric pressure. And so that's also going to impact at what point your sap has become syrup. So they will test just plain water first and see at what temperature the water boils. And then they will, anything that it's 7 degrees above the boiling point of water is when it's actually syrup. So you don't even have to have anything fancy. You can just have a thermometer and it will tell you whether you've reached syrup or not. So let me just skip ahead. I know we're starting to run low on time. So the first step is to tap the maple trees, and you want to collect that daily. Usually we would say to drill those holes at about chest height. And when you drill, make sure that you have a clean bit so that it makes a nice clean hole for the sap to come out of. It needs to be just ever so slightly down sloped so that the sap is going to flow out of the tree easily. Make sure that you use food grade gear only. We've seen people that have attempted to use cat litter pails and old milk jugs, and there are 100 ways to get this wrong and only one way to get it right. And that means if you use a garden hose to clean up your equipment, that garden hose has to be food grade. The first batch of sap that I ever cooked down, we used a brand new garden hose, and I had some of the prettiest syrup you ever saw, and it tasted like a swimming pool. The vinyl from the garden hose imparted that flavor into the syrup. So everything has to be food grade. And that means if you clean your equipment with anything, it has to be rinsed thoroughly, and don't use anything that has a flavor to it at all. The only thing I would allow an exception to this is for the pails. We have a lot of folks that will go to their local supermarket and they will get those 5-gallon buckets that they have the icing for the cakes in the bakery section. And typically those have a vanilla flavored icing in them, and those are fine. That doesn't hurt the flavor. But we had some folks from Virginia that brought over sap that they had collected in pickle buckets. And you guys are muted, so I don't hear you laughing, but you've not lived until you've tasted pickle flavored maple syrup. It was awful, like Aunt Bee's kerosene pickles. And so it's got to be food grade, and it's got to be food grade, something that would actually taste good. Don't mess it up. But you want to boil the sap down to Brix of about 55 to 60 degrees. And when you get to around 55 or 60, you're getting really close on the syrup. And it can scorch very quickly if you don't pay attention. So the first time I ever did this, I did it on a gas grill, and I had it in one of these turkey pans. And I had been outside with it almost all day. And I went back inside to get something to drink. And when I came out, it had already scorched half of it. Part of it was like really candy, just like a sucker. And then some of it was really, really thick. And so just know that when it gets time to finish this, you have to be paying very close attention, and don't let it go past about 62 or 3 Brix before you are ready to take it off. So the best taste and thickness of the syrup is around 66 to 66 and a half. If you go past that, it starts to get too thick, and it's really kind of a waste of your syrup. And if you're pouring it onto pancakes or something like that, it doesn't want to absorb into the pancake. It wants to just float on the surface. So, and if you're going to do this to sell, you're just giving away syrup. So don't take it too much past the 67 Brix. The little spiles that you can use, back in the day, people would use a piece of ash because it was hollow. They would just kind of ream out the pith and use that to hang a bucket from. But nowadays, folks use metal or plastic spouts or spiles, and they come in all different configurations. Some have little check valves in them. Others are reusable. The plastic are a one-time use. That plastic can get contaminants in it, just like a milk jug, and it will cause the flavor to be off. But on the metal, you can boil those and reuse them. As far as the size of the drill bit, you're looking at around a 7/16 inch bit or a 3/16 inch bit. It depends on the size of the spile that you're going to use. And so those are typically the two sizes that they come in. If you're using a hand drill, just make sure that you have extra batteries if you're going to do very many trees. And to set the depth, they actually have bits that you can order that have a stop on them that won't let you drill too deep. But the optimal depth to drill those is around 2 inches. If you don't drill deep enough, the tap hole usually won't work. And if you drill too deep, you're allowing that to kind of back collect, and that can cause problems. So usually around 2 inches is what you want to aim for. Again, you can either do the tubing, and if you look at the bottom picture, you can kind of see how they've got the tubing just coming down into a bucket. They've got plywood on top of the bucket. We just use the regular lid that came with the bucket. And if you drill the hole with the same bit that you drill the tree with, that tubing will fit in there very, very snugly. And so it seals out any water if it rains, so you don't have to worry about it getting diluted. But you do want to have it covered. You don't want rain or snow to accumulate in those. They also have plastic bags that are food grade and UV resistant. And I know folks have tried those, and it's just personal preference. As far as the collecting, ideally, if you can get your hands on a large old milk tank, those are awesome because you can refrigerate the sap and you can keep it a lot longer. You really got 48 hours to use the sap from when it comes out of the tree. And again, picture milk. If you left milk sitting out for a little while, it's still good. But if you go too long, it starts to sour. And that's exactly what happens with the sap. So if you use anything that is plastic, like an international bulk container or one of the big torpedo tanks like you get at Tractor Supply, those just need to be pressure washed and cleaned pretty well. If you decide that you're going to scale up, and we've had quite a few people around the state that have gotten into this and they really enjoy it, they've started to go with a full-on sugar house. You really would only need a simple turkey fryer or something if you're just wanting to experiment. But if you decide that you want to step up to a full-on evaporator, if you've got access to an old sorghum pan, those will work, or you can get an actual evaporator, which is what's pictured here in the bottom. And the difference between this and a sorghum pan is a sorghum pan is flat and not as efficient for this. And it works fine for sorghum because sorghum starts off at 16 bricks. But for something that's starting off at 1 to 2 bricks, these have a baffle in the bottom, and it speeds up the boiling process. Some other things you'll want to think about are filters to get rid of the niter and little impurities, especially if you're going to put it in glass jars where people can see it. These make great Christmas gifts. Really, people feel like it's a higher quality gift than the amount that you paid for it. So it's great for that. Make sure you clean all your stuff thoroughly and often and with food grade items. And if you use bleach, make sure that it's diluted, and you may have to get milkstone remover to get rid of the scale. Scale will build up in the evaporators over time. So I'm trying to think of what else to cover. If it starts to get cloudy or milky, the sap, get rid of it. Later in the season, that's when you'll start to see this. and it will be funky, and you won't want to eat it. So after it starts to get a funny smell to it, if it's not just perfectly clear, it should be suspect. It should be just like water. And make sure that you get all the debris out of it, those kinds of things. You can filter it with cheesecloth before you begin to evaporate. As far as the grading, if you're going to actually grade it, you'll want to get a different set of these graders every year because they tend to darken over time. But this is just like it is with honey. People prefer the lighter colors, and the darker ones tend to have a stronger flavor to them. And to me, I like the darker ones for cooking or putting in coffee or something like that, just because it imparts more flavor. But most folks are going to pay a premium for the light ones. Trying to think of what else. So some tools that you might need are tubing tools. And if you go to some of the suppliers that you might want to check out are Leader, Leader, and Bascom, Bascom, and CDL. Those three, and then there's one out of Canada called Lapierre. And I guess those four are probably your main suppliers. If you want smaller amounts of the tubing and things, you can buy that on Amazon or eBay and not have to buy an entire roll. But you'll see they'll send you the catalogs and you'll see what all the tools are. And I guess that's all.